The situation for Atlantic salmon is really very worrying, and last year the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation Networks, who keep an eye on the red list of endangered species, have put the salmon on that list.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Nick Measham says salmon farming is wiping out wild fish populations.
You can either have salmon farming, or farm salmon, or wild salmon. The two things can't coexist.
Nick says farm conditions cause deadly sea lice infestations to spread to wild salmon.
It's a bloodsucker, it latches onto fish and it literally sort of eats away at their skin and effectively eats them alive.
He talks about wider environmental issues affecting Britain's waterways.
There's a lot of talk at the moment about making sure the regulators don't impact economic growth, but actually, if you want to look after the environment, the regulators need to impact or need to increase the cost of certain things, because at the moment those costs are just wrong. Water is too cheap, we're not paying enough for it.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Nick Measham, CEO of the charity WildFish. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So the wildfish population is collapsing. This is why your charity exists. I mean, could you give us an introduction as to what's happening, how big the problem is and what's causing it?
What fish need to thrive is they need clean water, lots of it, and no barriers to migration. That's particularly true for the Atlantic salmon, which is one of the main species that we focus on. But it's true for all fish. They move around rivers a lot, and humankind has been pretty good at trying to convert rivers into things that they want to use. So we've built dams, water mills, things like that, all of which have an impact on, if you like, aquatic wildlife. So in terms of the state of our waterways, many of our rivers, the way that the ecology is measured, there are various ways, and one thing is to look at fish populations, and in most places fish populations are in decline, and that is because of poor water quality, challenges over water quantity, and so on. And I'll come on to some of those factors. But just to give you an overall headline figure, once upon a time our rivers were teeming with salmon. So much so that apprentices here in London rioted because they were being fed too often with salmon and they wanted alternatives. This was back in the medieval times. So now we've got a situation where the River Thames no longer really supports any salmon whatsoever. Any salmon that enter that river when they're coming back from sea, doing so by accident. And the overall UK populations have declined from, in-river catches of fish of hundreds of thousands to now just a few thousand. So the situation for Atlantic salmon is really very worrying. And last year the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation Networks, who keep an eye on the red list of endangered species, have put the salmon on that list.
Salmon used to be a food for the rich, but now it's kind of widely available. In our supermarkets, the salmon we'd see would be Atlantic salmon, most likely farmed in Scotland. Could you talk us through these open net farming practices and why you're campaigning against them?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because first up, a lot of people don't realise that the salmon that they're eating, which is now a very, very cheap source of protein, is not wild at all. The only thing that these fish have, these farm fish have in common with wild fish, is the word salmon. In other respects, they're very different. We're a wild fish conservation charity. Our concern is for the wild fish. These farming practices are devastating to wild fish populations. And let me explain how and why. Basically, the way these salmon are farmed, they're farmed in the sea, around our coasts, not too far offshore because it's easier to operate. You can get the food to the fish and things like that. And they're basically in open net pens. These pens are typically circular, probably have 20 feet or so 6 or 7 metres, maybe a bit more of net, keeping the fish in, and they're filled with farming stock, farm salmon. There are something like 200 farms off the west coast of Scotland at this point in time, producing something between 80 and 100 million salmon a year. So those farms have a number of pens, and each of those pens could have hundreds of thousands of fish in them. Those fish are a breeding ground for disease of all sorts. You can imagine when animals are penned so closely
Quite
together.
squashed in, yeah.
It's fairly dense. The densities are pretty high. They also are a breeding ground for a thing called sea lice. Sea lice are a naturally occurring, basically aquatic flea, if you like. It's a aquatic version of bed lice or something like that. It's a bloodsucker. It latches onto fish, and it literally sort of eats away at their skin and effectively eats them alive. That's going on in the pens. Those sea lice are also looking for other opportunities, and the innocent little smolts going out to sea, the WildFish going out to sea, going past those pens, sea lice will drop off the farm salmon and latch onto them. So they end up being harmed. And a small number of sea lice on a WildFish can have, particularly when it's young and it's sort of finding its way into the ocean, and there's a lot going on with it metabolically, it can be devastating to those small fish. It can also latch on to the returning salmon as well and cause them, in certain circumstances, problems. I mean, the sea lice is a natural phenomenon, but the problem is that these pens are massive breeding grounds for it, right. And they're also symptomatic of all the other pathogenic problems that are festering away. There's lots of diseases that the farm fish get, and some of those transfer to the wild fish. So that's one huge problem. Another problem of the open net configuration is that the farm salmon escape, and then and this is truly sinister, they breed with the wild salmon, and they basically are wrecking the genetic fitness of the wild fish. So you're losing, and that sea lice you could probably, is a reversal phenomenon. The genetic degradation of the wild salmon is not, and that's a really, really significant problem. And a lot of research has been done, and there aren't many wild salmon populations that haven't had some genetic introgression from farm fish. So that's the impact on the wild environment. Oh, and I'm forgetting, there's one other practice which is really quite horrific, and that is that in some cases, typically sea lice are treated with chemicals. They pour chemicals into the basically hydrogen peroxide bleach in varying concentrations, which sort of kills the sea lice but harms the skin of the salmon. As you can imagine, if you're having a bath in bleach, it wouldn't be your first thing you'd choose to do. But the other thing they do is the industry captures a whole load of fish called wrasse or lumpfish, which are wild sea fish. They're quite slow growing, and they use them to pick the tick. These fish will sort of eat the ticks off the farm salmon. They're sort of called cleaner fish. The tragedy is that these fish are being hoovered up in industrial quantities, so their populations are being decimated, and these fish don't survive the process. When the salmon are harvested, the farm salmon are harvested, the wrasse and the lumpfish get caught up in the process, and they're for the chop as well. So it's really damaging not only to wild salmon and to a sea trout, which is another migratory fish, which unfortunately for it, the salmon go off to their feeding grounds in the North Atlantic. The sea trout hang around the coast, so they get hammered by these farms, the sea lice from these farms. And so there's a huge damage to the fish population, wild fish populations, huge amounts and then pollution. Because if you think about it, these fish farms are producing a huge amount of fish faeces, probably as much sewage as the west coast of the population of the west coast of Scotland. on a daily basis, if not more. That's all going into the sea. These sea locks are often don't have very strong currents, so the bed of the sea locks gets covered in basically literally in crap. That chokes the seabed, knocks out various sorts of mollusks and other things that might otherwise be being farmed in that environment. The chemicals that are being used to treat the farmed salmon spread over many distances, and they're designed not only to knock out sea lice but other crustaceans. They'll harm baby lobsters and so on. Second problem, which is a more subtle one but does affect the wild salmon, is that the fish, the farm fish, have to be fed, and because they're carnivores, they need to be fed on fish, basically. Their diet needs to have a large amount of fish in it. So that's fostered a whole industry of sort of factory industrial fishing, where lots and lots of food fish, many of which are actually edible and we could eat, whiting, sardines and so on, are hoovered up, processed and turned into fish meal. That is depleting partly the food source for the wild salmon, but also livelihoods of people on the west coast of Africa. A huge amount of fishing is done around the west coast of Africa, and so on. So all of this is raising real questions of sustainability. The food then is cut mixed with soya, which comes from the Amazon, so I don't need to discuss the sustainability issues around that. So you've got a huge sustainability question that this industry, which likes to paint itself as a very sustainable green industry, is actually destroying the environment. Not only is it destroying the wild environment, it's all directly, it's also completely unsustainable. So that's really concerning. And the final issue is the welfare of the farm salmon themselves, which we're not a welfare charity, but you don't have to be to be horrified by the conditions in which these fish are farmed. The mortality rates of the farm fish are absolutely staggering. Typically, mortalities run at 25%, which is really quite staggering. So I've talked about being 80 to 100 million salmon being farmed off the west coast of Scotland, these 200 farms. You're looking at, last year I think there was something like 17 million salmon died before they got into the food chain. There's been a scandal recently. They've been illegally dumping, they scoop this stuff out of the nets and they have to get rid of it. And they've been, in many cases, burying it in great big sort of graves, in pits, in islands on the west coast of Scotland.
The last 20 years have seen wild salmon in Scotland's rivers decline by 70%. So I guess from your point of view, this is a really big issue here, how the wild salmon or wild fish are being affected by these farmed salmon.
The fact of the matter is that you can either have salmon farming, or farm salmon, or wild salmon. The two things can't coexist. And wherever there is salmon farming, it is the number one pressure on salmon in that particular, wild salmon in that particular area. And as far as the UK is concerned, the salmon farming industry is festooned around the west coast of Scotland and also around Shetland and the Orkneys. Now, people used to think that, okay, the west coast of Scotland, it doesn't have any big famous salmon rivers. So the problem of salmon farming and the impact of farm salmon on wild fish has been known for years, but it was kind of taken that it's a sacrifice worth paying for the industry and the jobs and all that. But there's now a growing realisation that the wild salmon that live in the east coast of Scotland inhabit their rivers, which is where most of the so-called famous salmon rivers are: the River Tweed, the River Tay, the River Dee, the River Spey, and so on, were immune to this because the salmon farms on the west coast of Scotland, so the east coast of Scotland, the fish are fine. But unfortunately, in their migration, they have to go past the Orkneys and the Shetlands. And we recently did some modelling research to show that the sea lice from those farms spread over quite a wide area and that the migrating fish from the east coast of Scotland, as they head off to their spawning grounds, are going to be swimming through these clouds of sea lice. We don't know precisely what that impact is at this point in time, but it's something again that's got to be borne in mind. And it's the experience of the west coast of Scotland, where both salmon and sea trout fisheries have been brought to their knees through the impact of salmon farming. So it is a very, very serious problem.
So where does responsibility lie in all of this? Is it just the farmers, the regulators? Do consumers need to vote with their wallets?
Regulation needs to play a role in sorting out what makes sense and doesn't make sense in terms of farming practices. But the bottom line is that intensive farming and the environment do not sit well together. And intensive farming is driven by the need to provide cheap food. So basically, that's where you have to sort of work back from. In the short term, we can think of lots of alternatives to farm salmon, other fish. The fish that would otherwise be used to feed the salmon, you can actually eat those, sardines, and so on. But changing consumer tastes, as we know, takes time. But that is essentially where we need to, we all have that responsibility. We can't have, as I said, you can't have farm salmon and wild salmon. So there's a choice to be made. And that choice, if it's sustainable, has to be driven by consumer preferences. So, and that comes on to the main aspect of our anti-salmon farming campaigning at the moment, which is called Off the Table. And that is designed to try and change consumer preferences. What we're doing, well, we spent years negotiating with the salmon farming industry and the Scottish Government to persuade them to regulate the industry in a way that wouldn't be perfect, but would be a lot better for WildFish than the current situation is. Basically, the long answer and the short answer is they refuse to do anything about it. Right. They've come up with sort of potential regulations, but they're a joke. And in every case, the regulations don't ever refer or ever look at the existing stock of farms. It's only they only bite with new farms. So it's the existing stock that's doing the damage. So you can see that basically regulation isn't going to work. So we basically got fed up with that and decided that the only way forwards was to change consumer preferences. And how do you do that? We're a small charity against a multi-billion-pound industry that's very slick in its promotion. Well, the answer was that we thought we've got to go down an influencer route. And stage one of that was we go to restaurants, fast food outlets, and persuade those people to stop serving farm salmon, and thereby start to gather momentum and change the way people think about farm salmon. We've now got several hundred. We've been going for a year or so with this campaign, about 2 years I think. We've now got several hundred, I think about 300 chefs in the UK signed up, and we've got more coming every day, and that we're now reaching quite a rapid rate of growth, which is fantastically exciting.
So it is a £1 billion industry, and there's thousands of jobs involved. Do you think there is a kind of point that can make everyone happy, like the industry, the consumers who maybe still want to eat some salmon, and the charities as well?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, first up is that the jobs, the Scottish Government and the industry, basically they justify their abhorrent farming practices by job creation. And the reality is that the jobs created are minuscule in the context of even the West Highlands of Scotland. And if you got rid of the industry and replaced it with ecotourism, you had more salmon in the rivers, so there's some fishing, there's people have to stay in the hotels and everything else around it. The other sort of ecotourism, canoeing around the coast of Scotland, snorkeling and so on, you probably create many more jobs. And the value added to the Scottish economy, even if you don't make those adjustments, the gross value added is not that significant, to be perfectly honest. And you can see the damage it's racking up. But is there a way of managing it? Well, you could go back to running much smaller, less intensive salmon farms, which is actually how it started in the 1960s, when it really was a mom and pop sort of crofting type industry where people had a few salmon and they grew them in cages and so on. So yes, you could do that. I'm not sure that the world ever goes backwards in that way, so I can't actually see that happening. I mean, from the point of view of wild fish populations, we need to end open net salmon farming, full stop, and I don't think there is an easy way around that one. Technology is looking at bringing salmon farming on land in so-called closed containment. So you build tanks on the land and you develop a process to farm them on land. That comes with other problems. It looks like it's a really good solution to the problem. It gets the farm salmon out of the sea, which is what my charity WildFish wants. But you've still then got questions, the wider questions of sustainability, because if you got that on land salmon farming working and you're able to scale it up, you're then going to be taking even more seafood out of the sea that isn't, depleting the ocean's natural food stocks in order to feed these fish. Because these fish they are apex predators. They're carnivores. They need, they need, if you like, they need fish to eat. Now maybe you can engineer food that replaces the fish in the equation. People are looking at using basically maggots as an alternative, things like that. I guess if you can think forwards and things like that are done so that the pressure is off the ocean food stocks, then maybe you are getting towards something that is sustainable. But there's a lot of hoops to go through before we get there. There are some people who argue that the densities required of fish required to make it pay on land because of the increased capital expenditure. Basically, the nets in the sea are, the resources are free because they're not paying for the seawater. They pay, basically nothing for that. So that's why it's a very attractive proposition. On land, of course, that's all different. The water's got to come from somewhere. They need energy to chill the water to maintain it at temperatures that the salmon like. They've got a chemical engineering problem in making sure that the water is saline and the salinity remains at a certain levels and so on. So it's a really complicated process, and so far I don't think anyone's got it working really, really well, and certainly not at scale. There've been lots of attempts, and but a number of them just haven't worked. And if something goes wrong or you get an infection in that closed system, of course, it can rapidly spread through all of the fish, and so you can lose your entire sort of farm of fish very, very quickly.
Fisheries Management Scotland released their catch figures for 2023, and wild Atlantic salmon was down 25% on the year before, which is a massive drop. So the CEO said that's alarming and said that we need to urgently improve the quality and quantity of the water in our rivers. How do we improve the quality and quantity of water in our rivers?
Problems come from, in terms of water quality, agriculture and, if you like, direct human impacts from sewage and road runoff, things like that. How do we improve those things? Well, agriculture, really tough. We have interestingly, we do have existing regulations and laws which, if they were actually enforced, would go quite a long way to improving the agricultural situation. They're called the farming rules for water, which are sort of observed in their breach, basically. What they require is that basically you move your farming away from the river as much as you can, and the impact. So you're not putting fertiliser on the land next to the river. You're not putting chemicals on the land next to the river, and so on. And that's also because what happens is that typically, farmers will farm right up to the, if you like, the riverbank almost. And when it rains, all of those chemicals they're putting on the land leach into the rivers. Typical problems are nutrients, phosphate and nitrates. Phosphate's the particularly bad one in fresh water. Those are put on the land to increase yields, fertiliser basically. They end up in the river. They promote weed growth. They're bound up with silt as well. That clogs up the riverbed so that when fish are laying their eggs, they dig into the gravel, and they need water to circulate around the eggs in the gravel, and they need the oxygen. The deposition of these fine sediments and the growth in weed and algae that results from those nutrients literally chokes those eggs. Right. So that's a huge factor. So you need to sort that one out.
So agricultural pollution is worse than the human?
Water companies who are responsible for sewage would say that it is. Farmers would say that it isn't. Right. And but the answer is that the science that's been done suggests that agriculture is probably a bigger factor in the reasons why our rivers are not reaching good ecological status. The problem is we don't actually know how much raw sewage is going into our rivers, but they're both highly problematic, put it that way. So we need to change the way that we farm. Farmers need to be encouraged to farm away from the river bank. They need to be encouraged to kind of manage their inputs, chemicals and fertilisers and so on, pesticides, all of the above, which can be done. It's being done for economic reasons because actually farmers are discovering that those inputs are expensive. So if they can actually manage that and manage the way that they put on the nutrients, so much the better. The other problem with farming is slurry, animal manure, and that has a very bad impact on rivers. It's much more potent than in terms of its ability to strip oxygen out of the water, which is the process that happens with raw sewage of any form. It's much worse than, if it gets into water, it's much worse than human sewage by a factor of sort of up to 10 times. That's another factor, but all of these things increase farming costs. So there's a political equation to be dealt with there. But essentially the law exists, and it should, would that it were enforced, that would be a major step forwards. And we've been pressurising the Environment Agency to actually get on and enforce that law. And there are some signs that they're beginning to do so. As far as the sewage water is concerned, basically, in order to keep customer bills down, we've been underinvesting. It's as simple as that. So what we need more sewage works, or sort of sewage treatment capacity, and we need, on the other side of it, we need more reservoirs, so we don't rely on the natural environment for our water. Really quite straightforward. Why hasn't it happened? Well, it hasn't happened because the government has been concerned about the potential impact on customer bills from, in order to fund the investment required. And we're still, to a large extent, stuck in that mess. We all know what needs to be done, and yes, as with agriculture, we've got all the laws we need to fix the problem. They're simply not implemented. and they're not implemented essentially for the reason I've said, is that the government took a view that customers were more concerned about the economics, the bills, than they were about the environment. That situation now seems to have changed somewhat, that balance, but we're now scrabbling to catch up. And the problem is, because we haven't been investing at the rate we should have been, there's a big bill to be faced to fix that problem. I mean, it's not insurmountable, but if you look at water as the water bills in the context of other utilities, typically your water bill, I don't know, for a household might be £400 or £500 a year for sewage and water. So, a few pounds a day, whereas your energy bills are going to be at least 1,000. So, 2 to 3 times more possibly than what you're paying for your water utilities. So water is cheap, and it is in that sense, it's underpriced. And you think, well, it can be fixed. But the problem is, every time you want to change these things, there is a panic that customer bills are going to have to go up over a period of time quite a lot. I think they should. Most environmentalists would agree with me. But you have got that resistance. And that's why the government hasn't enforced those laws that it must enforce. We've campaigned very aggressively to get the government to enforce the law. We took them to court last year, and one of the things that came out of that court case was that they have to enforce the law. And there are some other developments taking place at the moment. We complained to the Office of Environmental Protection that Ofwat, the water regulator, wasn't doing its job, and neither was the Environment Agency. And they are currently working through that complaint. We'll see what happens. But I think that things are changing, and it takes political courage to step up to the plate and say, this is what we need to do, these are the investments we need to make, let's do it. That will then deliver clean water as far as sewage is concerned, and they can do the same with agriculture. But it's making that decision. And the thing that worries me at the moment is that there's a lot of talk about generating economic growth. Great, but we need to think about what we're generating growth for, and what good is growth if we've trashed the environment in order to deliver it. You still need to protect the environment whether you're growing the economy or not, and there's a lot of talk at the moment about making sure the regulators don't impact economic growth. But actually, if you want to look after the environment, the regulators need to impact or need to increase the cost of certain things. Because at the moment, those costs are just wrong. Water is too cheap. We're not paying enough for it. And, the pressure on farmers to deliver cheap food is resulting in agricultural pollution, essentially. So that's the issue that we need to address there. But it can be done. It can be done very easily. We know it's not, there isn't any complicated science. We don't need any scientific breakthroughs to solve the problem. We just need, political determination to deliver the environment that increasingly people seem to want.
Nick Measham, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you.